Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie. I am the head of front-end development at Behance, which is an online platform for showcasing and discovering creative work. You can reach me at any point online on Twitter at Jackie Backwards, which is a tricky username to try and communicate out loud. I'll also be doing Q&A at the end of this session. I'll try and take questions from you guys in person, but I also thought I'd try something new and try Slido. I've never used it before, but if you go to that URL and put in code 8530, you can actually submit questions during the talk, and then I'll have a look at the end and go through some of those as well. So today I want to tell you a bit about Behance's journey growing and maintaining a large code base in an era where front-end technology is advancing and changing extremely fast. From our days of vanilla CSS through the introduction of preprocessors and all the way into our current day CSS in JS implementations. I'll go over some of our trials and tribulations, our growing pains, and I will even air some of our dirty laundry. But perhaps most importantly, how I learned to stop worrying and love the website. So the front-end web development ecosystem is moving insanely fast these days. It seems like a new tool or methodology for authoring HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is becoming available seemingly every single day. Whereas a few years ago, there weren't nearly as many tools with which to work on these things, probably in large part because complex things like responsive web development or single-page web apps weren't concerns anywhere close to our radar yet. But now, of course, we're seeing huge, rapid advancements in everything from the languages themselves to how we generate basically every type of code that we write, to the frameworks we use to organize our code, all the way to the build tools that we use to compile, optimize, and serve our code. And because there is always some better or faster tool becoming available to use, it can feel a little overwhelming having to choose and adopt the best new technologies all the time. Now, this is hard enough to do in a brand new project where there are no pre-existing code considerations, but it can be especially hard in a large code base or one that has existed for a long time, where when the moment you add something new, now suddenly everything else becomes legacy code. And now not only do you have a whole new set of code to learn and maintain, you also have to consider how it's going to work with all of this old code, as well as how or even if you're ever going to update this legacy code to use the new stuff. And when you compound these technical challenges with this industry pressure that you should be using certain tools or doing things a certain way in order to be a real developer, it can create kind of a harsh environment for being able to make the best decisions for your team and for your product and for your users, which on the code side can lead to things like way increased technical debt or missed project deadlines. And on the human side of things can lead to negative things like feeling imposter syndrome or even worse, burnout. Of course, it's super easy to compare ourselves and our work to others, especially in an era where social media fosters so much information overload. We see other websites or hear other opinions about the best way to do things, and we think, that's better than mine, or my website will never be that good, or I'll never be as smart as that person. But making this kind of comparison is kind of like comparing your life to someone's Instagram life. It's unrealistic to compare your reality to a highly curated projection. We all have way too much information about our own situations and not enough information about theirs. So what I want to do today is pull back the curtain on Behance's Instagram life, as it were, and show you the real side of our team's web development journey over the years and how we've faced all these different challenges. So if you feel like you've ever experienced these kinds of issues or challenges or anything like them, or might ever experience them, I want you to know you're not alone. So we've been evolving Behance's code base since 2010. When I joined the team 8 years ago, they had just finished a wholesale rewrite of the website from scratch. But since then, we've been working with the same one evolving code base. We've moved through different templating engines, CSS preprocessors, and a countless number of JavaScript libraries and frameworks. I joined as the 5th developer, and since then our dev team has grown to be about 40 people. And for me personally, although I started as a general front-end developer and was working kind of doing a little bit of everything across the whole stack, I have grown into focusing almost entirely on our CSS. I work really closely with our designers and also thinking about how we structure and architect our CSS across our different products. So in all this time, we've dealt with a wide variety of challenges. We are constantly considering which new technologies can serve us and the website and our users' needs best. We have a number of times had to figure out how to integrate new technology into old, even when there were massive functional disparities. We've had to determine when to actually start implementing these things, in particular balancing our product goals and roadmap with things like developer happiness and the health of the code base. And of course, we've had to figure out how to clean up any messes we left behind along the way. So there are a lot of opinions out there on what the best or the right way to build a website is. I'm not here to tell you that there is any right or wrong way to do any of these things. In fact, I'm kind of here to demonstrate the opposite. What I do want to tell you is how we've handled these challenges, why we made the different decisions that we did, and how they did or didn't work out for us. And I want to do this as kind of a means to reveal that no matter how pretty and put together things may look from the outside, when you pull back the curtain, the reality is no website or process is ever really as perfect as it may seem. So first, a little insight into Behance's size and complexity. If you're not familiar with Behance, it's a platform for showcasing and discovering creative work, which means that artists can come to our website and upload lots of different types of media, everything from images to video to audio to just plain text, if that's what suits them. And then we display their work and make it easy to be discovered by others through a variety of ways. So, for example, your work could be featured on our homepage, it could be displayed in one of our curated galleries, or it could even be surfaced through a feed of content that is automatically generated just by following different people on the website. We have user profiles, we have team profiles, we have a job list for finding creative careers and hiring creatives. We have a pretty robust inbox messaging and notification system, and there's even a section of the website where we stream live video almost 24/7, just to name a few parts of the site. So as of today, I counted about 50 pages on the website existing in various states of logged in or out. And that is made up of over 500 JavaScript files and about the same number of style sheets and almost 1,000 markup templates. So this number has been in flux over the years as we've added and removed various pages and features from the website. But the site itself is also evolving to become more like a web app as opposed to a traditional individual paged website. For example, like I mentioned, we now have interactive modular components such as our notifications feed and our messages feed that exist and can be seen from anywhere on the site, as well as things like a project pop-up or a user card that can be incited from lots of different areas of the website as well. But we have very humble beginnings. Back in 2010, when I first joined, we weren't using anything other than vanilla CSS to style the website. It's probably safe to say that at that time, you could describe our CSS development style as copy-paste driven development because we had no tools on the front end to help us reduce repetition. We weren't even using any kind of methodologies or naming conventions to help simplify things. So this is what the website looked like when I first joined the team. This is a screenshot from the Wayback Machine. There used to be something on the side there, but some things are lost even to the internet. And I would say that anything that you see on the website that wasn't like plain system font text or a solid color was probably made with an image. And this was because CSS wasn't nearly as robust as it is today. And we were trying to create something more visually interesting than we could actually do with native CSS at the time. Now, over time, we started to get comfortable using CSS features for visual flair where we could, understanding that the website didn't have to look exactly the same in every single browser. And honestly, once the designers learned that we could make as many CSS gradients as we wanted without having to make images for them, I got to become very intimately familiar with this tool. It takes a lot of different vendor prefixes and syntaxes to create a CSS gradient back in those days, and I certainly was not about to memorize that syntax. So in time, as browser technology was starting to pick up more steam, CSS as a language was advancing, we were really having fun with a lot of the cool CSS visual treats and tricks that we could do with native CSS. And we were getting more comfortable moving away from using images from things that we could now do with just CSS. We had an interesting additional challenge as well, in that we also had these offshoots of Behance that were themed galleries for different creative fields and these almost like white label miniature Behances for different schools and organizations. And now all of these used the same markup and styles and JavaScript as the main Behance website, just with additional style sheets loaded on top of them to customize each one for the look and feel of their brand or its creative field. Again, all of this lived within one code base, which of course meant that if you were changing something on the main Behance website, you then had to go and make sure that you didn't break anything on any of these other 40+ other websites that were built on top of that. It's kind of intense. So by now, we had a pretty clear need for a tool that was going to help us with our CSS development. Not only were vendor prefixes slipping through the cracks, having to handwrite them all the time, but thanks to all of these themed sites and galleries, we were absolutely inundated with copy-pasted CSS, especially where the only differences were things like font names or color values. Fortunately for us, by this time, CSS preprocessors were really picking up steam and looking like they were going to be the perfect tools to help us whip our CSS into shape. Now, the story I'm about to tell is not about the merits of any one CSS preprocessor over the other. But I do want to use it as a real-world example of the messy path to choosing, implementing, and actually using new tools. So, we were debating between Sass and Less, both great tools on their own, but we had to do proper due diligence and make sure that we picked the right one for our needs. Ultimately, Sass had more compelling implementations and features for our specific use cases, and Compass, on top of that, offered us a ton of extra power that was going to be absolutely perfect for our theming needs and for our sprite management. I mean, we were super excited about it. Sass and Compass were set to change our lives. The answer could not have been more clear. We obviously went with Less. But why would we do that? Well, in our case, we went with Less for a couple of reasons. At the time, there was only Ruby Sass, and since Behance was not built on a Ruby stack, it wasn't easy for us to implement or even get started using or trying Sass. Whereas on the flip side, Less could be really easily compiled by a very convenient little GUI app that you could just download to your computer, which meant that it had a much lower barrier to entry for us. We were still an extremely small dev team at this time, and this meant that we could start getting the benefits of a preprocessor much sooner and with less friction and less engineering time than if we had actually put in the time to try and figure out how to use Sass at that point. It afforded us another benefit too, though, in that we were actually able to use Less as a proof of concept that implementing a CSS preprocessor was a worthwhile investment. The time it took to implement it, to get it up and running for everyone to use, paid off drastically in development and improvement time down the line, which then meant that we were able to get team buy-in for adopting Sass, as well as negotiate for the development time needed to do so, and ultimately make the switch to the tool that we felt would suit us best. But our journey does not end there. Although we had decided the higher investment in setting up Sass was worth it, we did have to cut some corners to get there. To complicate things, we were now dealing with the dreaded technical debt of having a code base that was partially vanilla CSS and partially less syntax. So we would have to take the time to convert both of those into Sass. And we still didn't have a stack that could compile Sass for us. Traditionally, Sass was compiled as part of the whole Ruby on Rails asset pipeline, and we didn't have anything like that. But what we could do was install Ruby and Sass on each of our individual machines and compile and commit the Sass and the CSS to the repository from there. Now, we violated a lot of web development best practices by compiling CSS on our own machines instead of with a build tool. On top of that, we were committing an even worse crime of actually committing compiled code to our repository. Now, I highly doubt you'd ever find a medium think piece advocating for this kind of implementation. And I admit it gives me some anxiety to stand on stage and admit in front of this many engineers that we were committing such egregious violations of best practices by having literally hundreds of compiled CSS files in our repository. But on the flip side, I also cannot overstate how much benefit we were getting by having Sass available to us. For what sounds like a nightmare situation on the surface, I have to say, for the most part, actually worked pretty well for us. Suddenly, we were able to build our themed galleries and white-labeled sites in a fraction of the time, which meant that we were helping our users in our mission to give more exposure to creatives. We were able to do it with much less code than before, which meant that the code base became easier to understand and maintain. Although committing compiled code is considered a bad practice, for a large code base with a lot of interdependencies, it actually gave us extremely clear visibility into the reach that any individual change was actually having. And on top of all of that, it also meant that we had tools that could do some grunt work for us. So, for example, our designers could spend time actually designing things and focusing on the things that mattered, as opposed to spending time doing menial tasks like stitching sprites together. So in this case, we were able to find a pretty good balance between a subpar technical implementation with overwhelming developer and designer happiness, as well as code health by reducing a lot of our CSS technical debt and increasing our development speed. But what happens when you need a tool that doesn't seem to exist yet? It was around this time that we started work on a new product. It was a single-page web app for task management that we called Action Method Online. Being that it was a brand new product that we were starting from scratch, we had a rare and excellent opportunity to try out new technologies without having to worry about retrofitting any existing code into any new paradigms or anything like that. So we stuck with Sass for the styles, but on the JavaScript side, we actually made the decision to write our own JavaScript Mvc Framework, which we called nbd.js. And we built this at a time when Angular and Backbone were actually pretty popular and kind of established MVC frameworks. So why would we bother with our own, right? But if you look at the timeline, you can actually see that we were doing this when there weren't a ton of alternative options, or the ones that did exist were fairly new. And adopting young technology in a product that you anticipate or hope is going to live on for years is kind of a non-zero risk move. Now, I'm not saying that writing your own framework or using an existing one is better or worse than the other. But for the size of our team, which was still pretty small, and the needs of our product, being able to iterate on our own front-end framework was precisely what we needed at the time. And what ended up happening is that Action Method Online actually became a really good proving ground for NBD. Because it was born and forged for specific interactive and data-driven purposes, we were able to apply the techniques and practices that we learned there back on Behance, and we're able to start using it for some of the more complex content uploading and editing features that we were starting to build on Behance as well. By this time, Behance was evolving from its static website roots to become more modular and responsive. Now, executing this kind of huge paradigm shift was a really big undertaking for us. Basically, nothing about how the site was designed or built to that point was conducive to being responsive. The way we built the layout was completely rigid. The existing design was not immediately adaptable to smaller screen sizes. There was no design system in place to even organize this kind of massive visual update around. And most of all, we certainly were lacking the front-end tools that we needed to cleanly structure and implement the kind of responsive functionality that we really wanted to build. So while we knew we wanted to make the website responsive, despite the challenges in place by the existing foundation, we knew that a full rewrite was simply out of the question. We were still a small team, and we wanted to get something out to production to our users faster than a full rewrite would allow. So we had to come up with a different strategy. So this was when we started work on our first ever pattern library and style guide. We did this with the intention that the modular reusable components would help us in our endeavor to update the website to be responsive in smaller chunks and get things out the door quicker, as opposed to doing a more monolithic rewrite. So today you probably hear a lot of talk about design systems, but I would say the idea of a fully comprehensive design system hadn't really made it big yet at this point. But pattern libraries were really popular. It was around this time that Twitter Bootstrap was really hitting its stride and setting a strong precedent. And not only that, but it seemed like the dry principle of software development, or don't repeat yourself, was actually really starting to make its way into the ethos of CSS development as well. And pattern libraries and style guides were actually really well suited to help enforce this paradigm, not only on the code side, but also across the developer-designer barrier. And once again, since we already had a fully designed and built website that we were not starting over from scratch on, retrofitting a complete comprehensive design system would have been entirely impractical anyway, both from a design perspective and a development perspective. But we knew that modularity and componentization was going to help us a lot in the efforts that we were making to make Behance go from a non-responsive to a responsive website. So we built these modular components. We displayed them neatly in a style guide that you could view within the Behance website. We built them using Mustache, Sass, and our NBD JavaScript framework. We even started our own internal Sass library that we called Juliana. And these new components were mostly new in the code sense. Visually, they matched the existing components on the site, which meant that as we updated different pages of the site, we could replace the old UI components with the new ones that we built in this pattern library, basically meaning that anytime someone had handwritten out the code, with the markup and class names to build a UI element before, we could swap it out with this new shared component pretty easily. And then on top of that, as a matter of dealing directly with technical debt, we would also sometimes just carve out specific time with the sole purpose of ripping out old code and replacing it with these new components. Now, this was all just part of what it took to make the site responsive, and even still, I would say that the whole process of converting the site probably took a couple of years. The reality of the route that we chose is also that if you were browsing the website on a small device during this time, you may end up with two vastly different experiences on the website. Sometimes you may see a page that is perfectly optimized for your small device, and then while navigating, you may suddenly land on a very large, unwieldy desktop-optimized page. Now, once again, I doubt that you would ever find an article suggesting that having some pages be responsive and other pages not be responsive is a particularly good user experience. But we have to find a balance between a lot of different factors. And that's everything from our roadmap of products and features that we want to work on upcoming, to the time that we need to spend on technical debt or other features that aren't user-facing, to stakeholder interests, to the benefit that we can provide our users in any given amount of time. So while it may seem like an obvious choice to give the user the best experience possible by doing a wholesale rewrite of the website and delivering one comprehensive, complete responsive experience all at once, decisions like that are just never made in a vacuum. For us, taking into consideration a ton of different factors and variables, a piecemeal implementation was the best route. And ultimately, I have to say, I think it worked out. Although, yes, it may have been kind of weird for some users sometimes, some of the time. We prioritized highest traffic pages first, so hopefully we were reducing the chances of that happening. And also, to the best of my knowledge, like none of our users were so upset or scared off that they, stopped using Behance because we had this non-ideal implementation along the way. So anyway, back to the code side of things. At this point, we had a pretty robust toolkit on our hands. It's an interesting mix of open source and homegrown, but we've got Mustache for our reusable markup templates. We have Sass, Compass, and our Juliana library for our modular reusable CSS. And we're using nbd.js and require.js for our modular JavaScript. And these tools carried us well into about 2015 when we started work on another brand new single-page web app. This time, it's a website builder called Adobe Portfolio, which stood to be the most complex web application that we've built still to date. We had a lot of new technical challenges on Portfolio that we had never dealt with before. We wanted to build a full GUI, what you see is what you get website editor, where the user didn't have to code anything at all, and by using any one of literally hundreds of customization dialogues, the user could change their site and see it reflected in the editor in real time. And we wanted to do all of this all while maintaining an editor Chrome that needed to not interfere or intersect with the user customizations in any way. So although this product was totally different from Behance, there was actually some technical challenge overlap that needed to be solved that would benefit similar circumstances on Behance as well. In particular, being able to have components that didn't conflict or interact, as well as some of the more complex content uploading and editing features. So we started building Portfolio with these tools, but building and maintaining your own tools, it's not without its downsides and risks either. So by now, we'd really been starting to feel some of the growing pains of our homegrown frameworks and libraries. With our Sass library, Juliana in particular, it had actually become so over-engineered that nobody even wanted to use it anymore. I think there was this mentality that since it was a library that we controlled for our own uses and our own products, we felt compelled to make it as useful for any potential use case as possible, which mostly did nothing but lead directly to massively over-engineered code. Not only that, because of how we had set it up, it was actually so difficult to update and distribute the package that nobody even wanted to put in the effort to try and clean that code up. It meant that it was just so much easier and cleaner to create whatever new mix-in or function or whatever it was that you needed right in the code that you were working on, and should you need it in one of the other applications, just copy and paste it over there as well. We also came to learn a lot about the practical realities of using and maintaining your own JavaScript framework across an entire website. So NBD was originally built by just one of our developers and maintained by only an additional couple more of them. So this meant that it didn't move particularly fast. Other open source frameworks were advancing at a much higher rate. Our team was still very small at this point. Can't believe there would have even been more than like 5 people working on it. So that meant that not only were we missing out on the benefits that these open source advancements could give our products, but we would have been losing time if we had tried to implement the same or similar features back into our framework. It also meant that we found it was much more challenging for new hires to learn it. Documentation on NBD was sparse because the developers, A, weren't technical writers, and B, they were mostly busy spending their time developing either the framework or features for our products. And that meant that the universe of resources to get help was scoped entirely to a very small portion of our dev team. which, of course, then made it much harder to be self-sufficient if you were someone trying to learn this framework for the first time. On the flip side, popular open source frameworks came with the benefit of way more active and visible communities to tap into for help, which not only meant that you have a way bigger pool of resources to get help from, but it also means that there is an active community that you can give back to when you solve a challenging issue with something as well. So by then, it was pretty easy for us to acknowledge that these homegrown tools were no longer the best tools for our team or for the new types of products and features that we were building. Now, they had worked for us for a long time, and in some ways, they still were. There is no one day that you wake up and show up to work and realize, this is it. This is the exact moment that this tool has stopped being useful 100% for our product. There's a long tail of changing needs and considerations that goes into whether or not something is working for your team and for your product. Up to this point, we'd done well adopting modular JavaScript with NBD and Require. We'd done the best that we could scoping and componentizing our CSS as much as possible using the BEM methodology and some different Sass features. But over time, the truly scoped nature of burgeoning CSS and JS tools and frameworks was becoming impossibly enticing for our increasingly modular websites and web apps. And our current tools were simply becoming outdated in our evolving product and our advancing needs. Now, we had sort of an interesting perfect storm of timing for our team. After spending some time focusing on Adobe Portfolio's development, we split some of the team off and gave our attention back to Behance. We'd been feeling the need for some more advanced tech on Portfolio, and in the time that we had been building it, our designers had actually been working on a whole new look and feel for the entire Behance website. We wanted this to make a big splash. We wanted it to be a huge release to the world that would change the look of pretty much every single page on the website all at once, but once again, without starting the whole thing over from scratch. It simply would have taken way too long. The benefit wasn't there. Interestingly, this time around, it was a more widespread update than when we had converted the site to be responsive. Whereas previously we were making individual pages or groups of pages to be responsive, this time not only were we changing the look of components that were being used across the website, we also wanted to change the fundamental underlying code, and we wanted the whole site to get the benefit of this update all at once. So, with a big overhaul on our plates and a technical need to fill on Portfolio, the time was once again ripe for us to look towards new technology. Now, in the same way that the industry at large has opinions about the best tools to use, so does any given dev team. So what we did was we held group discussions, lunch and learns, knowledge sharing sessions for anyone who was interested, where we would discuss the pros and cons of seemingly every JavaScript and scoped CSS solution under the sun. And we would actually try out the best candidates in the admin section of our websites, which are just kind of like a backend area of the website that only employees could access, but were really useful as a means of giving us a near real-world proving ground for these different tools. Ultimately, we decided on Vue and CSS modules for this new task. But by now, the story probably is starting to sound pretty familiar. We've come full circle on needing new tools, investigating new tools, choosing new tools, and then, of course, actually implementing them. And although the specific technical implementation details may differ, the ideas and methods that we use to actually get the job done are pretty much the same. We exclusively built new features using these new tools and frameworks, which meant that we could start using them immediately. We rebuilt the existing UI components alongside their existing implementations, which could then be put into use as different parts of the website were updated. And perhaps most critically, we did all of this behind what we call feature flags, which is basically just a check in the code that serves one set of code or another, depending on your user's gatekeeper setting, which meant that we could build all of this alongside the existing website without interfering with it, while also still having the ability to see all of this new stuff in action, in production, before it was actually ready for its public debut. And this actually brings us to where we are today. The website is not fully converted, but we continue to follow the same practices as we update and develop new features. As an interesting aside, although we are fairly recently into our transition into Vue, we've actually recently made the decision to switch to React. We haven't started using it on Behance yet, but we intend to start soon. And I bring this up to illustrate kind of a different point than any I've been able to make yet, which is that sometimes, depending on your situation, decisions are bigger than just your team and your website. So in our case, for us at Adobe, there is a broader movement to get the different web teams within Adobe using the same framework so that we operate in less isolation and can knowledge share across teams more easily. This means that we can help, obviously, not only our team and our products, but other teams and products in the organization as well, which becomes very useful when we start to work on integrations and things like that, which makes sense. So if you look at the arc of front-end development on Behance over the last 8 years, it's changed pretty drastically. In 2010, our biggest concerns were around perfecting the slickest looking CSS gradient, or getting the website to look pixel perfect to the mockups, or finding the best jQuery image carousel plugin. But now, in 2018, not only are we concerned about how the website looks, but we also have to consider how to optimize our code for the least repetition, how to get the best performance, how to handle complex data and state management, all while making it function in more browsers and devices than possibly ever before. And since the CSS has become more closely intertwined to our JavaScript and markup in modern frameworks than ever before, our concerns are no longer isolated just to the CSS or the JavaScript independently. And because CSS and JavaScript as languages move so fast too, we end up having a much bigger and more robust ecosystem that we need to have a deep understanding of. Front-end development is hard. Front-end engineering is hard. But I encourage empathy in your decision-making and your interactions around it. Every technical choice is relative, and there is no one right or best way to build a website. So, in case the examples so far haven't sufficiently illustrated the beautiful, messy path that web development can take, I will air a little bit of Behance's dirty laundry. In case you've ever felt bad about the skeletons in your code closet, hopefully these will help you feel a little bit better. Hopefully this is also therapeutic for me. So first of all, that custom JavaScript framework I told you about that we realized wasn't working for us anymore, we still use it. We don't build new features on top of it, but some of our bigger core features are built on top of it, and we do still make updates to and maintain the framework. We are still using 3 different template rendering engines across the site, which is a relic of our transitions over time. And actually, depending on which page of the website you're viewing, you might actually be seeing all 3 of them in action at once. This just happens to be the first page you see when you log into our website. I went to cssstats.com and ran some stats on one of the main CSS files on our website. And as you can see, we have a lot of different shades of gray. I'm actually not too upset about this, though, because I remember I ran this a few years ago, and we had over 60 shades of gray. So I'm feeling good about this improvement. And I like that we're consistent about the brand blue. At least we've got that going for us. I searched our code base for some to-dos because I figured there could be some fun stuff in there. And I immediately came across this one, which is in the head tag of a section of our website. And it says, to do, there is a lot of stuff included here that is just unnecessary, which sounds bad and isn't particularly actionable, but I had never noticed this before, so I checked the Git blame because I wanted to see just how long this had been a problem for. Okay. So while I was doing this, I was like, okay, while I'm looking for to-dos, I might as well actually like clean some up while I'm in there. So I found this one, and it says, to do, remove after statistics are fixed, 2 more times, and then a delightfully urgent, keep this one. So I found this in the CSS for our notifications, and I honestly could not figure out what statistics has or ever had to do with our notifications. So check the Git blame on that also. I didn't fix it. So here's a longer one. This one says to do. This is due to Chrome 43.0.2357.65 introducing a phantom subpixel width enlargement on parent containers. Remove when fixed. Now, that's a nice descriptive to do, although I'm not immediately clear why a width property is a problem here, but whatever. Let's see if Chrome is like updated since this was written. So I checked when that specific version of Chrome came out, over 3 years ago. But, let's see what version of Chrome we're up to today. And I guess that might not be a problem anymore, but I also didn't fix it. We have a page on our website that we actually never made responsive. It's not even like this page doesn't get traffic. Granted, it's not the most popular part of the site, but people definitely visit it. We just never actually prioritized making it responsive. And finally, my personal favorite. If you remember how I said we started committing compiled CSS to our repository way back in 2011, well, we did that for over 5 years and only stopped doing it about 1.5 years ago, very long after a number of viable solutions had become available for us to not have to do that. Not great. So if it sounds like I'm saying our website is kind of messy and imperfect, good. That is what I'm saying. But ultimately, I'm proud to say that I work on Behance, even now that you all know how the sausage is made. It's not perfect, but the difference between not perfect and bad is all in how much you focus on it. The closer you examine something, the worse it seems. But everything that we've built, actually, is the result of hard work and smart ideas and really good teamwork. I actually feel really lucky to work with such a driven and compassionate group of engineers who care deeply about the work that they create, the products that they're building, and the impact that they have on the lives of people who use it. And ultimately, I think that these are the values that really make our industry what it is, not what the latest cool framework is or having a pristine or perfect code base. And that's it. Thank you.